Okay, so I took as my topic my reading of the title that Scott suggested to me, which is Confessions of an Astrological Antiquarian, Archiving the Days of Future Past. So I made this into quite a personal account. I'm not going to do a whole lot of presentation of particular findings from my research. This is more an account of what I have been through as a journey as a becoming antiquarian in the area of astrology and people I've met along the way who've had a big impact on that. Astrology is a vast subject that from the outside resembles a deep iceberg drifting dormant in a cold ocean. Its shallow but many-furrowed ice cap glistens with selective allure in the sunlight cast upon it, enticing some passing sailors in the sea of life to disembark and explore its hidden valleys, while most others muster a smile as they behold the gleaming surface spectacle only to sail on by. A few of those landers go on to drill down into the submerged depths of the iceberg with probes that reveal their many-layered richness. My acquaintance with astrology was limited in my childhood to the glimpses afforded by the mass media in the form of the daily forecast for the 12 sun signs produced by prominent British media astrologers such as Russell Grant on breakfast television and the late Jonathan Caner in the pages of Today newspaper before he moved to the Daily Mail. Whether or not one considered them scientific, sun sign forecasts such as Caner's were appealing from the standpoint of their exploration of universal human concerns in the light of principles associated by astrologers with both the sun signs and the transiting planets. They were food for thought and often psychologically insightful, but they were not enough to persuade me to study astrology further. As a teenager, I became deeply interested in philosophy after finding the Christian religious education instilled by the schools I had attended in my childhood to be unsatisfactorily doctrinaire and incomplete as an exploration of the fundamental principles of life. At the age of 17, presented by a philosophy teacher with arguments by René Descartes that claimed to prove the existence of God, I found myself analytically deconstructing the manifest sophistry on which they were founded. Intellectually, I was a rationalist, but my rationalism was never a closed-minded one. I was open to truths revealed by experience, and had long been fascinated by experiences at the frontiers of science, such as symbolically meaningful dreams, extrasensory perception, and glimpses of ghosts. While attending university to study French, I began to regularly record my dreams in detail in a written diary and to compare their content with subsequent experiences. This study led me to some personally surprising conclusions about the ability of the dreaming mind to access perceptions that would reach the conscious mind only in the future, since on frequent occasions, specific details of dreams would manifest in subsequent waking reality, which cast some of the famous prophetic dreams recorded in the Old Testament of the Bible in an entirely new light, as possibly much more than just a convenient myth. It also made me realize the limitations of the by then standard modern psychoanalytical readings of dreams in terms of Freudian symbolism relating to basic human drives and desires, which simply did not accord to the reality of my dreams at all. In fact, it was so far removed from them as to strike me quite clearly as false doctrine. In my mind, I had moved beyond harboring a skeptical mindset towards orthodox religious doctrine and was now challenging orthodox psychoanalysis and even received scientific views on the limitations of human perception. I was deeply engaged in this private study of the significance of dreams when I first stumbled upon a full-length book on astrology. It was not an advanced book, but it was an engaging one. It was an account of human relationships through the lens of the interactions of the natal sun signs, written by the best-selling author Linda Goodman. Initially astonished by the lifelike relatability of her depictions of the interactions between the sun signs, I was moved to suspend disbelief and explore Goodman's writings further at the earliest opportunity, which presented following the completion of my second year's university studies during the summer holidays prior to my scheduled year abroad in France. At first, I took the time to read Linda Goodman's two main works of relevance, Sun Signs and Love Signs, in detail, reinforcing my sense that her observations were by and large true to life, although there were some elements that struck me as arbitrarily doctrinaire, such as, for instance, her division of Scorpio suns into three types represented by different animals. At the same time, intellectually, I found myself trying to reconcile the seeming fact of the truth of her psychological observations of the sun signs with my received understanding of science, and particularly the orthodox doctrine of causation and its implications for human nature. Perhaps it occurred to me to consider sun sign astrology could be explained in terms of the varying psychological experience of the environment in the formative months of newborns, depending on the seasonal conditions at the times of their births. However, during the autumn of 1995, I began to read my first book by other authors that taught the calculation and interpretation of the birth chart as a whole. To my surprise, its readings of factors beyond sun signs and beyond even moon signs largely rang true. I tested them not only on myself, but also on relatives. In particular, I compiled a complete interpretation of my father's birth chart from the readings in that one book and sent it to him in the post from France. He expressed strong identification with them. Considerable soul-searching ensued. How could it be that distant planets so tiny as seen from Earth could have any effect on us humans at all? The seasonal psychological explanation for the sun signs that I had thitherto postulated made no sense at all of there being any influence from the planets beyond the luminaries. My received view of scientific causation was now more fundamentally threatened. Or could the seeming accuracy of the planetary readings just be an illusion born of the power of suggestion? I was not yet entirely sure, so I set out to explore the subject further and began in 1996 to collect a considerable number of books on astrology that went into far more depth than the three I had started with. My task was made easier when I returned to the UK that summer and spent much of the summer writing an 18,000-word dissertation in French on the global environmental movement at my mother's apartment in Edinburgh, Scotland, but still had time left over for studying astrology. Aside from finding several decent modern new books by authors such as Stephen Forrest and Geoffrey Wolfe Green in a local branch of the major national bookstore chain Waterstones, I made multiple visits to a very good specialist esoteric bookshop in the city called Body and Soul, which had quite a few others in its shelves, and better still, had access to an order catalogue for astrological books published in the USA, thanks to an importer then active called the Airlift Book Company. This was well before the internet was in common use in the UK, so international book orders had to be placed the old-fashioned way. Soon I had 30 books on astrology, and after reading and digesting David Handlin's harmonic charts, had begun to develop my own mathematically based integrated system for calculating the orbs to be allowed for any class of astrological aspect, and worked this up into a handwritten article that I submitted for consideration to the Astrological Association's Astrological Journal just before starting my final year's university studies. Advised in response that publishing in the journal was the privilege of members of the association, I joined up for a year to formalise my submission. The thinking behind my article was that if astrology was a science and aspects were to make sense as part of that, astrologers could and should do better than arbitrary fixed orbs of 8 degrees for all major classes of aspect except 6 degrees for the sextile, and then a sudden jump to 2 or 2.5 degrees for the semi-sextile, quincunx, semi-square, and sesquiquadrate. This scheme of orb allowances had struck me as so obviously flawed in its unevenness and lack of systematic coherence that I had instinctively found common cause with such harmonic theorists as Hamblin and, initially as reported in Hamblin's book, before I later discovered his works in their own right, John Addy. But Addy's scheme of simply dividing the orb assigned to the conjunction by the circle division factor on which each aspect was based struck me as simplistic and too severe to be true to life in its impact on, for example, the orb allowed for the square as compared with that for the conjunction. So I devised a more complex orb calculation system involving one mathematical operation in application to major aspects and a second additional one in application to minor aspects, and the full workings were included in my article. By the time I had graduated with my BA Hons degree in French, in the summer of 1997, I had between 50 and 60 books on astrology, many of these being the fruits of two international orders from Body and Soul Bookshop, some of the books and the second of which had taken months to arrive from the USA. However, disappointed by the lack of a definitive response forthcoming to my article from the editorial board overseeing the Astrological Journal within my first year of membership of the Astrological Association, I did not renew my membership for a second year and stepped away from the astrological community for the next 4 years, although I continued to study and practice astrology privately in my spare time. The non-publication of my article a year after it was submitted struck me as being as good as its rejection, and it occurred to me that this was perhaps partly because I was an unknown in the astrology world, and perhaps partly because my scheme for aspect orbs challenged received modern tradition. It is in my nature to challenge authority and advance new ideas. The exact opposition received from my natal Aries sun by Pluto in Libra testifies to this, and I'm accustomed to resistance or occasionally stunned silence as a response, having experienced much the same kind of reaction to the intellectual ideas put forth in academic essays as a student, for example. I have never won friends in high places by challenging received ideas, but it is who I am and what I am constitutionally primed to do, and my motive is pure, the advancement of human understanding. In the summer of 2001, after taking time out from astrology to focus on songwriting and music production, as well as trying to make ends meet in a succession of insecure temporary jobs, I began to be actively involved in an online astrological community on the Microsoft network, initially becoming a regular visitor to the MSN chat astrology room before joining forces with one of the other regulars who had set up a new community on the MSN group service, which I proceeded with his full authorization to develop with astrological content. Over a period of 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, I researched and wrote up a fairly complete set of articles on the elements of astrology and on the principles of 3 of its branches: natal astrology, relationship astrology, and predictive astrology. To undertake this writing to a higher standard, I sought out more sources. By the spring of 2004, I had a collection of 300 books on astrology, crammed into a couple of bookcases within my study. These now included many historical sources, albeit in modern editions and translations, or reprints of older ones, encompassing the output of publishers including what was originally Deborah Holdings and latterly Peter Hill's imprint, Acela, John Ballantrae's Ballantrae reprint, Robert Hand's Association for the Retrieval of Historical Astrological Texts, Robert Schmidt's Golden Hind Press, and David Rowell's Astrology Classics, as well as the corporate facsimile reprint of books on a very wide variety of esoteric topics, Kessinger Publishing. Using these books in the preparation of my articles for the astrological community on MSN groups had added historical depth to the presentation of the different astrological topics they broached. I had begun to drill down into the astrological iceberg with a probe and to extract and publish meaningful data arising from those explorations. At the start of 2004, the parts of my article on the significations of the planets in astrology that dealt with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were accepted by Deb Holding for parallel publication on her new website, SkyScript. And within a year of that, I had begun to regularly contribute to the books forum within her site, often starting topics based on gleanings from the older books I had recently acquired, although in some cases simply commenting on ones found in online listings. I would have also continued to research and write up new articles on the different facets of astrology in much the same vein as I had been doing if my life had not then fundamentally changed as it had done by then. But around the Easter holidays of 2004, I became romantically involved with a Swedish woman who had been among the assistant managers of the MSN astrology community I now jointly ran since the autumn of 2002. She had always wanted to be a published writer, but the global market for Swedish language books is relatively limited. And learning that I had also been an enthusiastic writer since my childhood, she saw value in joining forces with me on a children's fiction writing project. So we agreed that from then on, my work would be 50% writing with her and 50% astrology. And that summer, I moved out to Stockholm to join her, at first temporarily for just a few months before I had to return to the UK for paid work, but then permanently from 2005. In the meantime, mindful that the MSN Group service might not be sustained permanently, and also that the community hosted by it in which I was involved was under the terms of its own rules, a strictly non-commercial educational one, I had already secured the domain name astrolearn.com for a future independent astrological website and set it aside for later use. Over the remainder of the 2000s, alongside writing children's novels in consultation with my then Swedish partner, I continued to collect books on astrology. From scouring the second-hand book listings on sites such as Abe Books, Elibris, and eBay, I had already come to realize that there were many more layers to the iceberg that was the historical body of astrological literature. A great many books were permanently out of print but still in copyright and therefore unavailable to reprinters. So I collected second-hand originals, and they opened up new vistas on the development of astrology during the 20th century. Further to this, I found that not all out of copyright historical sources on astrology were yet available in reprint form at all, even though they legally could have been reprinted. Besides, of those that were, many had been reprinted in a crude monochrome facsimile quality that made reading a less than immersive experience, and quite a few had more serious problems with their reproductions, such as completely obscured text and even missing pages and tables. Inspired by a particular interest in the history of medical astrology, in 2005, I ordered my first antiquarian original printing of a book published before 1800, which was Ebenezer Sibley's 1795 book, A Key to Physic and the Occult Sciences. It was an affordably rough copy, suffering from serious leather rot, with the result that its binding was splitting and needed completely renewing. To that end, I had soon visited an experienced Italian bookbinder based near the centre of Stockholm. One did a lot of regular commissions for the city's Royal Library and was happy to take this on as a small private project, returning Sibley's book to me with an all-new leather binding that should keep the contents in good condition for the next 200 years or more. I was now becoming an astrological antiquarian, and in the more than 20 years since, I have collected a great many original antiquarian editions of books on astrology and closely related subjects. It was, I believe, during the early part of 2006 that I first met the late Maurice McCann on eBay of all places. He and I were both bidding on an auction listing for a rare first edition 2-volume set of Alfred Pierce's textbook of astrology, whose respective volumes were published in 1879 and 1889. It was a known fact that the 1-volume edition of 1911 that was later reprinted by the American Federation of Astrologers in 1970 was incomplete as a representation of Pierce's text, because the treatments of mundane, electional, and medical astrology in particular that had been full in the original edition of Volume 2 were severely abridged for the combined edition of 1911. At that time, bidder identities were still publicly visible, and not just to the seller, and it was possible for bidders to directly contact each other. Seeing that I had been outbid by a bidder whose screen name included the first name Maurice, I guessed correctly that it might be none other than Maurice McCann, who was then a well-known scholar of traditional astrology. After he bid up to $300, I realized that he was very seriously interested in researching the work and decided to let him win the auction, even though I did not know how long it would be before I would get another chance to acquire a first edition set of Pierce's textbook. Following the end of the auction, I messaged him through the platform and asked whether he was Maurice McCann, to which he replied in the affirmative. We subsequently became online friends, and about a year later, upon learning that I had already collected many sources of relevance to his MA dissertation on which he was working while enrolled as a student at the Sophia Centre, he consulted me for help. By early 2007, I had numerous sources from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Maurice was investigating who in history had changed the traditional system of planet-based aspect orbs to the modern one that gave all major aspects almost exactly the same orbs, regardless of the planets involved. His working hypothesis had been that it was Alan Leo. With reference to the sources I had acquired, I was able to persuade him otherwise, for instance, by locating a reference within Zadkiel's Handbook of Astrology from the early 1860s that had advocated the general use of 5 to 7 degrees for all planets. It was a curious coincidence that Maurice was researching historical changes in the use of aspect orbs over a decade after I had been challenging the modern system myself, albeit from a very different perspective from his, as he was a staunch traditionalist in his approach to astrological technique. And now I was actually assisting one of the most influential teachers of traditional astrological methods in his academic research. In one gracious email, he told me I had saved his MA. This felt like a form of external validation for the literary resources I had been building up. They were already becoming useful to a prominent published researcher on traditional astrology. But this was only early 2007, and the collection still had a long way to go. By that time, I had begun to collect important sources in French, my second language, such as vintage issues of Alexandre Volgin's Les Cahiers Astrologiques, and books from the early 20th century by authors such as Karl Ernst Kraft, Janders, and Julevno. The French language section was the first I developed in another language. Then from the late 2000s, I began to collect important German sources. In the fullness of time, I came to realize that the extent of the German astrological literature of the 20th century exceeded that of the French equivalent. And having at first been a much smaller section of the collection as a whole, the German language holdings would ultimately surpass the French ones in terms of shelf space filled. From 2005 onwards, I had begun to purchase academic books of relevance, initially chiefly editions and translations of older texts, such as those by Abu Mashar, but increasingly also scholarly studies. By the time Ben Dykes had announced the publication of his complete translation of Italian late medieval astrologer Guido Bonatti's Liber Astronomiae as the Book of Astronomy, I already had a reprint of the Latin source text in my shelves, and recognizing the importance of the book within the history of astrology, I was one of the very first to order Ben's translation in its original magnificently hardbound 2-volume edition. Accordingly, it is hand-numbered 4 out of 500. I later lent him the volumes I had collected of Richard Lemai's critical edition of Abu Mashar's Great Introduction to Astrology, sending them through the post internationally from Sweden before he returned them the same way. This was years before Ben's own translation of this work by Abu Mashar was published. Here again, I felt that my collecting efforts had been useful to an active scholar of traditional astrology, even though in this case I had not done any of the research. While he was still alive, Dave Rowell also consulted me for assistance towards a number of his publishing efforts. For example, I was able to supply some materials that went into his special memorial edition of Vivian Robson's Student's Textbook of Astrology. Further to this, the Astrology Classics editions, which is to say Rowell's imprint, of both Luke Brufton's The Elements of Astrology and George McCormack's textbook of long-range weather forecasting, were directly drawn from the original printings that I had collected. Through the Skyscript forums, I met Swedish academic historian and traditional astrologer Martin Ganston, and we arranged to meet for a meal in Stockholm with our respective partners one day. Subsequently, as Martin was working towards his book on primary directions that would eventually be published by Wessex Astrologer around 2009, I checked a number of sources for him as well as providing feedback on the calculation method he was teaching. It was satisfying to contribute in a small way to bringing another book on traditional astrological techniques into being, and all the more so when it was written by a friend. The year after Martin's primary directions book was published, he was one of the speakers at the Sophia Centre Conference of 2010, which was held in the English city of Bath. For his lecture at that conference, Martin spoke about Thomas Oxley and quoted an amusing citation that I had found within Oxley's 1830 book, The Celestial Planispheres, and had published within a relevant Skyscript discussion earlier, one giving Oxley's rationale for advocating for a move to circular charts from square ones. Martin graciously credited me as the source of this quotation within his lecture. In the audience was Rob Hand. I had had no direct contact with him before, and he spoke soon after Martin. At the end of Rob's lecture, I approached him to ask him some questions. At first, he looked a little taken aback, as he did not recognize me. Then he looked at my name tag, and something seemed to click as he said, "Oh, right." I felt sure that he had recognized my name from Martin's mention just an hour or two earlier. After that, the conversation ran smoothly. Rob's work had been a big and positive influence on me in my early studies. I had made extensive use of planets in transit and planets in composite, two of the few dozen books I had purchased way back in 1996, before also discovering his historical work. A three-way conversation between Martin, Rob, and myself ensued, during which I shared with them some books I had then recently collected and brought along with me to the conference, including a first edition of Mark Edmund Jones's early booklet Evolutional Astrology from 1916, for which purpose Jones wrote under the pseudonym of Figulus. Rob called this a treasure. At the main conference dinner, I ended up sitting on the same table as him in what felt like a rather exclusive head table group around Nick Campion, at which I felt like something of an imposter. But in the event, Rob and I freely discussed Renaissance Latin astrological literature half the evening, leaving the rest of the table in a rather awkward silence, as though out of their depths and not knowing what to contribute on the subject of such great authors as Johannes Schörner or Andrea Argoli. By the end, I felt I had made a friend, or at least a friendly colleague, in someone I had long looked up to as an influence. A further moment of external validation for my efforts came in the mid-2010s, when the academic Susan Somers, having discovered one of my articles of relevance to Ebenezer Sibley on Skyscript, contacted me in relation to my findings. She was working at the time on a biography of the Sibley brothers, which was eventually published years later in 2018 by Oxford University Press as The Sibleys of London. Part of the art of building a library in any subject is knowing what to look for. Research skills of relevance come with practice and with familiarity with important bibliographical resources. For older books and periodicals on astrology, but particularly those written in English, F. Leigh Gardner's 1911 book Bibliotheca Astrologica remains a mine of valuable information and has given me many leads over the years, though it does not cover anything beyond the 1900s and has some lacks. For astrological books published up to and including the 17th century, there are two major resources of importance. One is Lynn Thorndike's 8-volume History of Magic and Experimental Science, which is a monumental historical reference work that covers a very wide range of subjects. But the astrologically relevant ones by themselves are invaluable and give a narrative account of the lives and works of many otherwise obscure European astrologers of the past. The other is Leandro Cantamessa's Astrologia Ins and Outs, which is chiefly just a lightly annotated book list, but an extremely thorough one, covering virtually every conceivable early printed book on astrology in every edition known. Another important bibliographical work is the Biographical Dictionary of Western Astrologers by the late James Herschel Holden, the erstwhile research director of the American Federation of Astrologers. He is strongest on American astrologers, but also covers a large number of British and European ones. It is also useful to be familiar with online library records. The major database for the institutional holdings of books and periodicals held by libraries in the USA is hosted at worldcat.org, though it was traditionally known in the trade as OCLC. WorldCat also details the holdings of a limited range of libraries in the UK and Europe, but is far from comprehensive for those territories. The direct British equivalent is JISC Library Hub Discover, a silly name that reads ungrammatically owing to its combination of nouns and verbs, but it's still a useful resource. It used to be called simply COPAC before its rather clumsy rebranding to its present hard-to-remember name. The equivalent for libraries in German-speaking countries is the Karlsruher Virtuelle Catalogue, or KVK, and for those in France is the Catalogue Collectif de France, or CCFR. There are comparable resources in some other territories as well, but for my purposes in building an astrological library, and also for dating undated books, those four have been the most useful. During the latter half of the 2000s, I began to build up a section of Indian astrological literature, having started with just one 2-volume work around 2003. This has since been developed much further and now fills 23 shelves across more than 3 full-height bookcases in a dedicated Asian interest section of the library that also includes 8 shelves dedicated to Chinese and Tibetan astrological and divinatory traditions. Most but not all of the Indian books follow the Vedic tradition, and I have also included in this section books by Western astrologers who use Vedic methods even when they are published outside India. Finding the space needed to accommodate the Asian section of the library, filling as it now does more than 4 whole full-height bookcases in itself, has taken time and effort. In fact, finding the space to develop even the French and German sections to their full extent has required the relocation of the library on more than one occasion. For the first few years that I lived with my Swedish partner in Stockholm, I fit all my books into 4 bookcases within her apartment, of which 3 were in the entrance hall and the 4th in a bedroom. However, by 2008, she had become deeply unhappy by this use of the space and wanted to free up storage space for other items. That summer, she made a private agreement with her stepfather, who was then in his late 50s, whereby I would move my books and by extension my whole working base for astrology-related work to a room in his house, which was in a village in the countryside about 2 hours west of Stockholm. To sweeten the deal for him, she arranged that I would personally pay for the cost of materials he wanted to insulate a room in his house that would be used for the books. This went ahead smoothly enough, although it was a very cold house with no central heating, only a central log-burning fire that barely adequately heated the upstairs rooms in winter. So from that autumn onwards, I then split my time between working there and in Stockholm. The added space afforded by a dedicated room for books allowed me to expand the collection significantly over the next 18 months, assisted by some savings I had inherited from my grandmother. Unfortunately, although perhaps predictably with hindsight, the move also proved the prelude to a full separation from my Swedish partner in 2010. After being summarily sent back to her stepfather's house from Stockholm at short notice that April, I was on my own. And when it became apparent to her stepfather that the separation was permanent, he issued me with a deadline to move out together with all my belongings by the end of that year. As a result, I then had to scramble to find an affordable apartment to move into locally. By this time, my growing collection, which had surpassed 4,000 books and now more closely resembled a small library, needed an apartment that could take a lot of weight as well as the sheer volume. If I could not find a suitable home in time, I would have to move my books into storage or even back to the UK. Fortunately, the local major landlord had a vacant 1-bedroom apartment for which the rental was at the time barely 3,000 Swedish krona per month, equivalent to about £270 or US dollars 400 at that time, if I recall rightly. It was just within the realm of affordability for me, and as it was in the same village, the cost of moving would be minimal. So I signed a contract to take up residence there immediately that December. Then I got packing up all the books, which together filled 100 boxes, and paid for my ex's stepfather to hire a flatbed trailer from a local depot. It remained only to load all the boxes onto the trailer, one trailer load at a time, and he drove everything across, pleased to get my belongings off his property. During my time there, I had paid for not only the insulation of the room I had used, but also a costly new electrical fuse box for his house and other forms of rental in kind. He had done all right out of 2 years of putting up with the inconvenience, and I was just grateful to get safely out with my book collection unharmed in the circumstances of my separation from his stepdaughter. From December 2010, I was therefore now a single person living alone in my own apartment with 100 boxes of books that needed unpacking and shelving. It had one really large room, unencumbered by radiators except under the single window, and was on a solid ground floor that could take the weight. So I installed 21 full-height bookcases and one half-height bookcase, all within the same room, and even fit my desk under the window where the radiator was not going to do any damage to books. In this new setting, the library thrived for the next 5.5 years and continued to grow in fits and starts as far as income allowed. I accommodated the additional arrivals by making use of the very tops of the bookcases and installed 2 or 3 additional bookcases in the entrance hall. From the summer of 2011, struggling at the time to eat adequately while paying the rent and bills, I decided to embark on a program of full-time Swedish learning at the Adult Education Centre in the nearest county town, Örebro. This was supported by a system of student grants and loans. Since I was a legitimate immigrant with the right paperwork, it significantly improved my Swedish, as well as giving me a much appreciated small circle of fellow immigrant friends that took my mind off the sadness of my recent separation. It should, in theory, also have made me more employable in conventional work settings within Sweden. However, after 2 years of full-time study in summer of 2013, I felt that I really needed to make more use of the book collection, so I began a major book scanning project that culminated in the production of 5 DVDs, each filled with English language out of copyright texts from my collection. Their titles should speak for themselves to anyone familiar with the names of the major English-speaking astrologers of the early modern period. From Lily to Partridge, from Sibley to Simonite, from Cook to Pierce, Godfather of Modernity, the Alan Leo Legacy Volume 1, and Itinerant to Eternity, the Alan Leo Legacy Volume 2. Each was produced with custom DVD cover art I had designed myself, and I handled all steps of the production process of every copy produced of each of the 5 titles, using an internal DVD writer and an inkjet printer with a CD printing attachment. The 5th and last of these compilations of scanned astrology books was published during 2015, and I was working towards the 6th, but its realization was delayed by a slow response to a copyright clearance inquiry. Although sales of these DVDs were mostly direct, the American Federation of Astrologers, of which I have been a lifetime research member since 2010, also made a small wholesale purchase of the first 2 titles to have appeared in 2014 for its online shop. Since then, it has become very uncommon for personal computers to contain DVD drives, so I have moved to an online sales model for the individual book scans through my astrolearn.com website, which was finally launched in 2015, 11 years after I registered the domain, and has now been continuously online for over a decade. Additionally, in 2025, I helped the American Federation of Astrologers I helped the Astrological Association, that should be, launch a new low-cost subscription-based digital library called the International Astrology Library Online by scanning 100 books from their library and converting them all, together with over 320 volumes I had scanned previously from mine, to a format that allows for online browsing without downloads. All the scanned books that were originally released on those DVDs can now be browsed in this format as an alternative, with all proceeds of those subscriptions going to the Astrological Association. Anyone who wants the original PDF files of the books from my library for offline use can still purchase them individually from my website. In the summer of 2012, after completing the first year of my studies in Örebro, I returned to the UK for a short while to visit my family there and attended another of the Sophia Centre conferences. On this occasion, I met Professor Charles Burnett of the Warburg Institute, who was speaking that year, and ended up having lunch out in Bath in a small group consisting of Professor Burnett, Bernard Eccles, and two anthropologists who were not astrologers and whose names I have unfortunately since forgotten. By that summer's conference, Dr. Jennifer Zart had begun to be involved with the Sophia Centre as assistant editor of its journal Culture and Cosmos, working together with Nick Campion on this, and she was in attendance. Having recently read about her studies of historical German astrologers, and especially Elsbeth Ebertin, I was eager to meet her, as I had begun to collect German astrology books from much the same period. So I introduced myself to her towards the end of the conference, which was the first she had heard of me, and I wasn't sure I had made quite the best impression on her to begin with, but we gradually struck up a cordial, collegiate kind of friendship thereafter. 2 years later, around the summer of 2014 or thereabouts, Jen contacted me with a request for a foreword to a new edition edited by Wade Caves of William Lilly's autobiography, to be published by Rubido Press, the publishing company that Jen co-directed at that time. This I gladly provided, but only after reading the original text of Mr. William Lilly's History of His Life and Times thoroughly, a process that took a few days because there was so much to digest. I wanted to make sure that I was well informed on the text before commenting, although a large part of what I wrote up about was the edition history of Lilly's book. Wade's edition was duly published in 2015 to celebrate the 300th anniversary of its first publication. By 2016, the apartment that had now been my dependable home for more than 5 years was running out of space for the still growing book collection, to the point that by then I had several piles of books and magazines horizontally stacked high on the tops of some of the bookcases, and had had to recourse to filling several shelves with small paperbacks to double their proper capacity, each with 2 rows of books back to back, so that half of them were inaccessible. The collection had exceeded the capacity of the apartment. Besides, DVD sales were slowing down, and I was having to resort to selling off duplicate antiquarian books I'd collected just to pay the bills. That summer, my elder brother offered me a job in his business back in the UK, and the economic pressure on me had reached a point where, despite this not being a move I had wanted, I felt forced to accept. The result was that my book collection had to be meticulously packed up in what was by then 204 boxes and shipped to my mother's house in Bristol, England, then stored 3 boxes high in a downstairs room she had cleared for the purpose. There they remained, and there I lived in the smallest spare bedroom for the next 18 months, until, after establishing myself economically again in increasingly full-time work for my brother's business, I could afford, with some greatly received family assistance, to move into my own place once more. But even then, the books could not be moved in right away, because I had chosen a fairly old house from 1911 that had ample space for bookcases, but was in fairly poor condition. After taking the keys in February 2018, I had to hire a succession of tradespeople to get the house in order. Internally, everything from the plastering to the flooring, the electrics, the central heating, and the kitchen and bathroom needed attention. Besides, 7 single glazed windows had to be replaced with new double glazing to improve insulation. The rusting cavity wall ties needed to be completely renewed, and the roof needed replacing. Only once all that was done could I move the books back in towards the end of the year. Relocating from Sweden had been tough and had put the library entirely beyond use for more than 2 years, but the end product was a much more spacious setting that not only allowed for all materials to be properly shelved, but also left room to spare. In choosing the house, I had measured and calculated that the 3 downstairs rooms apart from the kitchen could, if fitted out with new radiators under the windows, instead of the old ones that had been along walls, accommodate as many as 50 full-height bookcases, or about twice the number I had had in use by the time I had left Sweden. This measure of space would surely future-proof it for some time to come. Over the past 7 years, the library has had a higher public profile than it ever had in Sweden and has been visited by astrologers and academic historians from 5 continents. However, as of early 2026, those 50 potential bookcases have not only been fully built and installed, they have also been almost completely filled. The library is once again at capacity in its new location, 10 years after it exceeded the capacity of its previous one. I'm conscientiously winding down acquisitions of books now, mindful that there is no more space, besides which I need to live economically for a while if I'm to complete my writing plans. In 2009, I had rejoined the Astrological Association after a 13-year break, as I now wanted to collect and stay up to date with their publications. The wounds of my article on harmonic aspect orbs having been overlooked were no longer fresh, and I was prepared to put this in the past. At first, I played no further active role in the association. Then, not long into his tenure as editor of the Astrological Journal, Victor Oliver, who seemed eager to source good material to publish, agreed to take on one of my original History of Astrology articles, which was A Brief History of Astrological Journals Part 1, 1700 to 1830. This appeared in the Astrological Journal for July to August 2016. Almost 2 years after I had first submitted to him an article, I had finally, sorry, that should read, sorry, something like almost, I think I got the wrong number of years there. It should read almost 18 years after I had first submitted an article to the Astrological Journal for publication. I had finally had one published. It felt like a minor miracle, but perhaps it also reflected the fact that by the time Victor began editing the journal, I was a fairly well-established presence in the online astrology community, giving me more seeming credibility than I had had as a young student of astrology in 1996. Besides, I now had something original but less controversial to contribute, something that was chronicling the past in a way that few others could do because they lacked access to the materials I had accumulated, but without needing to put any spin of personal ideas or opinions onto it. That autumn, I was asked nicely by Mescalina, the spiritual name by which Italian astrologer Nunzia Coppola prefers to be known, for a second time to speak at one of the international astrology conferences she had been organizing for several years on an annual basis in the Italian city of Perugia. Her first invitation a year or so previously I had turned down because I lacked the means to afford the international travel. I had also previously rejected an invitation to speak at an international astrology conference in India during the mid-2010s for the same reason. This time, however, I finally accepted. The conference took place in July 2017. I was now in my early 40s and had just become a conference speaker on the history of astrology for the first time, after contenting myself with writing astrological articles for publication only on the internet since 2002. There was an unusually limited time allowance for this engagement because of the requirement for an interspersed Italian translation, so my whole lecture had to fit into about 20 minutes. I therefore selected a narrow historical topic, the philosophy of astrology in English language astrological literature between 1784 and 1811, selecting just 4 or 5 major authors from that period to cover. One of the Italian attendees came up to me afterwards and graciously said it was for her the best lecture of the conference. Among the other speakers present on that occasion, whom I already knew through other channels, were David Cochrane, Santino Mancuso, and Wade Caves. Upon learning of Wade's edition of Lily's autobiography and of my contributions to it, Mescalina very charmingly called us both up to the stage at one point in the proceedings to announce that we had worked on the book together to the assembled, mostly Italian audience. This was not quite true. It was really much more Wade's book than mine, but I think Wade took Mescalina's comment in a good spirit. In connection with the preparations for that conference, I had made friendly contact with one of the other invited speakers, Smiljana Gavrancic of Serbia. Although in the event she had to drop out, thanks to the friendly association we had struck up, I subsequently became a regular contributor to the astrological periodical she had founded herself, Infinity Astrological magazine. Aside from printing the transcript of my conference lecture, she also accepted for publication a continuous run of 11 new historical essays that I wrote for Infinity between 2019 and the very last issue, which was for November to December 2020. Early in 2020, Maurice Fernandez approached me online and asked if I could contribute an article for the Career Astrologer, as was then the name of the magazine representing the Organization for Professional Astrology, and I willingly did so. A second such commission followed a year later in March 2021, this time in combination with a 20-minute slot in a group webinar alongside Laura Nalbandian, Kay Taylor, and Stormy Grace. Around that time, I was also asked to write for the Mountain Astrologer for the first time, once again by Jen Zart, who had recently become the editor and had proposed a new column called Primary Sources. She turned to me first to see if I would be willing to write it. I jumped at the chance. This marked the beginning of a regular series of profiles of historical astrologers that I researched and wrote up for inclusion in every standard issue from April 2021 until the magazine shut down in late 2024, or 16 issues in total. Only in a few special issues were my contributions unwanted. It was truly disappointing to me when the old TMA shut down just over a year ago, since I had plenty of plans in reserve for the column and would have continued it indefinitely or for as long as my health allowed. Later in 2021, I was invited by Italian astrological historian Lucia Bellizia, who had been among the Italian astrologers attending the Perugia conference, to contribute a lecture to that year's European Conference on Astrology, a relatively recently launched annual online event that was unrelated to the Perugia conference and was instead presided over by a rotating leadership of facilitators representing different European countries. Having attended my talk in 2017, she remembered me, and so my second conference speaker engagement materialized 4 years after the first. In 2022, I was again asked to speak at the annual European Conference on Astrology, but in that instance, I had to decline because of poor health. However, I was asked for a third time a year later, and that time I accepted again and spoke at the event for the second time in 3 years. Amid all these goings on, in the summer of 2020, I've been asked at short notice to house parts of the Astrological Association's collections because their then librarian, Trudy Charles, was planning to end her hire of a lock-up garage where they were stored. The items in question were primarily periodicals in all languages and non-English language books. Between them, these would prove to be enough to fill 11 bookcases. To accommodate them, I had to reorganize the second largest upstairs room, which is the room I'm sitting in right now, lining two of its walls with 8 new bookcases, and also to reorganize some of the downstairs to make space for 3 more bookcases there. At that stage, I had not yet filled the downstairs to the 50 bookcase capacity it potentially held, but now the time had come to accommodate 3 new bookcases downstairs. I had to move quickly in that direction. So I built 4 new bookcases to go in the middle of the smaller downstairs room, moved out the contents of 3 of the others from one of the larger downstairs rooms, and used those 3 others to accommodate the additional items from the Astrological Association's archive that would not fit in the 8 new upstairs bookcases. Little did I know that my role in supporting the association would not end there, however. Early in 2022, Trudy and her husband announced that they would be downsizing in retirement, as is, of course, their right, and so the AA would have to find another home for the rest of the library comprising the English language books. Once more, I was approached for help. I did not have any space, but as luck would have it, I was about to have a garden shed installed, and it was put up just in time for me to empty the entire contents of the smallest of the 3 upstairs bedrooms into it, thereby freeing a dedicated room for the English language books from the AA's library. In this room, I built and placed 9 new full-height bookcases and a pine table with 2 matching chairs. I also hired a carpenter to build custom pine shelving in the alcove, providing 7 more shelves and a further run of high-level shelving around the 3 non-window containing walls. Between all these new fixtures and the previously unused very top shelves of the 8 bookcases in the large upstairs room, I was able to fit not only all the new arrivals from the AA library, but also the contents of one of the downstairs bookcases previously filled with materials from the AA archive. Against all seeming odds, virtually the entire book holdings of the Astrological Association had been squeezed into my house, collectively filling 19 bookcases, 7 built-in pine bookshelves, and 3 longer top-level wall shelves. Still, one element of the new organisation persistently grated with my sensibilities, and that was the lingering presence of 2 bookcases filled with periodicals from the AA archive in the downstairs of my house, immediately adjacent to the contents of my private library. It was an unsatisfactory arrangement while the 2 collections remained under separate legal ownership, and a clear recipe for the mixing of materials between collections by visitors, even if I were to take every care to avoid this myself. Surely something had to be done about this if it could. After careful measuring up in the large upstairs room that already contained 8 bookcases round the walls, I hit upon a solution. The one free wall, which had been reserved for my hi-fi system, could be used in parts if only I moved the speakers forward a bit. So I did, and somehow or other managed to squeeze 2 newly built, full-height IKEA Billy bookcases around their backs, one to either side of the stands housing the hi-fi equipment. Then all that remained was to move the AA's periodicals upstairs. With that mission accomplished, I once more had space to expand my own library downstairs, for a while at least. Since after the AA's English language books had joined the rest of their materials in my house, I was now officially regarded as the AA's librarian. I was invited to attend the AA's annual conference, an event I had never been to before in that role the following year, which was 2023. In the circumstances, I decided also to apply as a speaker, and my proposed talk from Sibley to Zadkiel was accepted. While researching towards it in the summer of 2023, I prepared more than twice as much material as I would have time for in an hour's talk, and had to make savage cuts in order to fit it within an hour. But I met Victor Oliver in person at the conference for the first time, and he offered to serialize the full version in the pages of the Astrological Journal. Although at that time my column in the Mountain Astrologer was still running, I could not turn this invitation down. With a slight delay, the series began to appear in the January to February 2024 issue. It has reached its 11th installment in the issue for March and April 2026. The 3 times when it has not appeared have resulted from Victor having too much material to accommodate in those issues, resulting in it being postponed to the next issue. There are still a couple more parts to edit into shape, but the series should be finished this year. Victor also commissioned for me a one-off article on the Italian Renaissance astrologer Luca Gaurico, which was published in the September to October 2023 issue of the Astrological Journal. As of today, I've had articles or installments of longer articles published in 43 issues of 4 different astrological periodicals, all within the past 10 years, and all on historical themes. I'll be talking for a second time at the Astrological Association conference this year, further to which I'm starting a programme of occasional online history lectures for the Astrological Association that are free to attend, of which the first is tomorrow, March the 14th, and will cover early sources on psychological astrology before World War I. It's the first part in a series of such talks that will gradually take the timeline forward, and they're scheduled once every other month. Additionally, I'll be giving a talk for one of the annual International Astrology Day events presided over by Turkish astrologer Ona Doser on March the 21st. In 2025, a first compendium volume of my collected essays on the history of astrology was published by Gensart's latest imprint, Revelor Press. It is called Technical and Planetary Developments in Astrology and contains the text of the first lecture I gave for the European Conference of Astrology, together with 6 previously published essays on different historical themes and one previously unpublished one, which is on the early history of sun sign forecasting and was written in 2020, but selectively edited in late 2024 after new historical information of relevance came to light. Nick Campion agreed to write the foreword to this compendium volume and has been very supportive of my work. The details of 3 other volumes have been agreed with Jen, but I need to get through a few months' obligations first, including book editing commissions for other astrologers, before I can return to completing those other volumes. I hope it will be worth the wait. In March 2024, after 7.5 years, I quit my employment for my brother's company, continuing only on a limited freelance basis to support continuity and basic income. So that is to support continuity for my brother's clients and basic income for myself, obviously. And I work just 2 days a month there. This suits me as it means I can put in more concentrated time on astrological research and writing projects, although my income is now closer to that of a struggling student than a mature professional. Nearing the end of my 40s and feeling tired out by the old routine was the stimulus that finally pushed me to make the break, and I have no regrets. The office job was useful income while it lasted and has supported major improvements in the library holdings. But at this stage in my life, I'm resolved to prioritize living meaningfully and with less stress, over earning and acquiring. For the time being, I'm actively discouraging in-person library visits because I have such a backlog of work to complete. And I ideally want to get those remaining compendium volumes for Revelor Press finished this year. I may therefore need to be firm and to formally request no more visitors in 2026, aside from those whose visits have already been privately agreed. If I do have to put people off, I hope they will understand and not take it as a personal rejection. Good faith visitors will once again be welcome once I finish those books, and in the long run, it's my intention to make arrangements with others that will secure the library for the future, because it is now the product of 30 years of collecting and has conserved a very large amount of scarce and valuable primary source material, in addition to numerous secondary academic studies, all of which should be found to be of use to astrological researchers and historians far into the future, if only suitable arrangements for their secure safekeeping that still allow researchers access can be made. This may well prove to involve a joint effort with the Astrological Association, although it still has the right to make other plans for its library if it so chooses. Thank you very much for listening to my long ramble, and I will hand back to Scott.
And we will now do Q&A.